Hello, and welcome to an overview of the origins of the Cold War, starting with the end of World War II and moving through the mid 1950s. In the closing months of World War II, at the Yalta Conference, the three major Allied powers, Stalin from the USSR, FDR from the USA, and Churchill from Great Britain, met to discuss what Europe would look like after World War II, specifically concentrating on Germany. They decided to split Germany up into four main zones: France, Great Britain, Russia, and America, each controlling one, and the USSR promised to allow free elections in their territory, both in Eastern Germany as well as other parts of Eastern Europe. They did not follow through on that promise. With the death of President Roosevelt a few months later, his vice president, Harry S. Truman, became president after the close of the war in Europe, but before its end in Asia and Japan. They, led by America and the USSR, started the United Nations, met in San Francisco to discuss and to create this international body. Its main purposes, quoted here in the document, are peace and security, human rights, and to help other countries talk and be friendly to each other. And you can say what you will for the UN, still headquartered in New York City, but since its creation, there has not been another world war. I want to do a quick overview of the underlying economic systems this should be reviewed and concentrate on the questions of liberty or equality. The first of these is capitalism. Its goal is to maximize liberty or individual freedom. First put forth by Adam Smith in that auspicious year, 1776, in his book On the Wealth of Nations. He lays out the basic ideas behind capitalism, the idea of free enterprise, that everyone is free to pursue any economic activity they wish. There is very little oversight or government regulation. Think of the concept of the invisible hand. The invisible hand of the market is going to determine prices. The government is going to be laissez-faire or hands off and not interfere. Everyone has the freedom to succeed and the freedom to fail. It is also the basis of the private ownership of the means of production, or the factories and the businesses are owned by individuals and eventually corporations, but not by the government. You can contrast this, of course, with communism, put forth by Karl Marx, 1848, in the Communist Manifesto. Its goal is to maximize equality, right? So it limits personal freedom and liberty, but it maximizes equality based on the horrible working conditions in the businesses and factories across Europe as well as in the United States. History is a class struggle between the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and the proletariat, or the workers. And eventually, the proletariat, the workers of the world, are going to unite, rise up, overthrow the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and are going to redistribute the means of production. So everyone has what they need and no one has more than is necessary. So everything is owned in common, right? No private property, hence communism. The hybrid or middle path is often called socialism. It tries to balance or mix the equality of communism and the liberty of capitalism. It has some private ownership as well as some public ownership of different corporations or parts of the economy. It also could have strong regulation of those parts of the economy. It often has high taxes to help spread money and to give programs to the poor. You can think of programs we have here in America that started in the New Deal in the midst of the Great Depression. Things like Medicare and Social Security, as well as Medicaid, are all efforts by the government to alleviate some of the excesses of capitalism through what is commonly identified as socialism. Which brings us back to the conflict between these larger systems, embodied in part by a speech given by Churchill here in the picture at a college in Missouri, 1946, where he says, "An iron curtain has descended across much of Eastern Europe," and you can see it visualized here in a red line on the map. The Iron Curtain blocking the eastern communist-dominated parts of Europe from the western, more capitalist and generally more democratic parts of Europe. This is one of a series of responses to the growing perceived threat of the USSR. Another is developed under President Harry Truman, who asks his Department of State for some guidance on how to handle the encroachment or the perceived advances of the USSR. And a minor diplomat in Moscow called George Kennan writes back to Washington, D.C., what becomes well known as the Long Telegram, a very lengthy letter about what he feels should be the American policy. And the key idea he spells out that becomes the dominant American policy during the early years and potentially later years, we'll come back to that, of the Cold War is known as containment. His thought is that the goal of the U.S. and the other powers of the quote-unquote free world should be to contain the spread of communism, not to confront it, not to go to war against it, but to contain it, right? To limit its advance, to stop its spread, and eventually, in his theorizing, it will collapse under its own weight. Of course, his theory eventually proves correct about 45 years later. One way that they seek to contain the spread of communism is through the Marshall Plan, named after the current, under President Truman, Secretary of State George C. Marshall. He was also the general leading all of the Allied forces during World War II, and he puts forth a plan to help rebuild Europe, basically through money, through loans, and through corporations that are in the U.S. You can see on the map how the $20 billion was spent. The larger the blue line, the more help each country got. The idea being we suffered through the First World War, and then we left Europe to its own devices, and it never really recovered, and this arguably led to World War II. So this time, let's avoid that problem. Let's help to rebuild Europe and to avoid another World War, and not coincidentally, to make them friendly and very sympathetic and welcoming to America as well as to American businesses. Another way that they seek to contain communism is through the Truman Doctrine, right? The thought that as communism spreads, we must act to limit its advance. So we act in Greece to stop the spread of communism, right? The Greeks, as well as the people in Turkey, had long had tensions dating back to ancient history. And as the communists from Russia are seeking to advance their military in Turkey to establish order, to spread communism, and they want to do the same in Greece. But George Marshall, he of the Marshall Plan, helps Greece to combat communism as well as Turkey. Through money, through supplies, through trucks, through food, through cash itself, they can give money to build these countries up and not coincidentally to help stop the spread of communism as well. This is also most famously done in Germany. You can see that eventually the three regions in West Germany are combined into a West German government, the British, the French, and the American. But the East German region, controlled by Russia, stays on the side of communism. This is another place where we seek to contain the spread of communism. You can see here in the Eastern region, entirely surrounded by East Germany, is the old capital of Berlin. It is also split into East and West, but West Berlin, backed and supported by West Germany and the British and the French and, of course, the Americans, is cut off in 1948. Basically, they blockade these roads and cut off West Berlin, hoping to exert influence and basically take over all of Berlin. President Truman begins the Berlin airlift, dropping in food and coal and supplies and anything that they need into West Berlin over many months to show the Russians we will not give in. And eventually they relent and reopen the roads through East Germany from West Germany. However, in the end result, they do split into two separate countries because nobody really trusts Germany to be unified at this point, given World War I as well as World War II. And because so many people are fleeing East Berlin into West Berlin in 1961, they build a wall between the two halves of the city. These rising tensions are best embodied by two international agreements, the NATO agreement and the Warsaw Pact. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it unites basically all the powers of Western Europe, as well as Greece and Turkey, which were backed by the Marshall Plan, to America, as well as Canada, through a mutual defense pact. All of the members of the pact agree if any one of us is attacked, we will come to the defense of each other. The goal is here to warn off Russia in the rising Cold War tensions that if you attack West Germany or England or France or any place, we will all come to each other's defense. Interestingly, the only time that this provision actually was used was when we were attacked on September 11th, and the other members of NATO agreed to come to our defense. Russia sees this and wants their own version, so a few years later, they create in the town of Warsaw, Poland, what comes to be known as the Warsaw Pact. Basically, the mirror image saying all of these countries in Eastern Europe are going to come to each other's defense as well. This is a symbol of these alliances emerging after World War II in response to each other, so that this is another example of the rising tensions and the threat that each group, led by America and Russia, views the other poses to its very existence. Keep in mind that Russia lost 20 million people in World War II, so their thoughts of the threat of an invasion from Germany or Europe were not wholly unfounded, but they also didn't exactly allow freedom in voting, so that's not too good either. In the emergence of this new post-World War II order under the auspices of the UN are the emergences of new states. One is the Jewish state of Israel. Following World War II, unsurprisingly, a lot of the people left in Europe who happened to be Jewish were a little threatened by staying in Europe, and they wanted their own country, a place where never again could they be turned away, and where Jews always would have a home to come back to in some place in the world. Unfortunately, historically, this region had been claimed and lived in both by Jews as well as Arabs, as well as some Christians. In 1947, the UN develops a plan to split the historical region of Palestine that had been part of the Ottoman Empire, shown here in green. Splitting it practically in half for the new Jewish arrivals from Europe and parts of Northern Africa, and half for the pre-existing Palestinians, or the Arabs and Christians, as they were broadly known. The Jews were in favor of this plan. The Arabs did not accept, and this begins the Arab-Israeli crisis. You can see increasingly over time, the white areas were Jewish in 1946. Green areas were controlled by Palestinians. And over time, through their military and through their expansion, Jews, the people of Israel more broadly, come to control and dominate the region. And the green areas are now what is left under the control of the Palestinians. We will come back to this concept and idea. It is crucially important both at the time and, unfortunately, historically, still to the present day. Another important geopolitical event happening in these years is the emergence, or, quote, the fall of Red China, when the long simmering civil war between the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong, is finally ended. October 1949, Mao Zedong and the Communist Army of quote-unquote Red China takes control of mainland China. The nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek flee across the straits to what is now called Taiwan, and China becomes communist, and it becomes known as the People's Republic of China. This is going to have a tremendous impact both on American as well as world history, which we will come to. In the immediate aftermath of this, the growing spread of communism is symbolized by the Korean War. After World War II, a line is drawn along the 38th parallel right here. North Korea being controlled or dominated by the USSR and communism, South Korea being controlled and dominated by America and capitalism and eventually democracy, though in the early years, not so much. 1950, the USSR and North Korean troops attacked the South, crossing the line and pushing the troops from America and South Korea all the way down to this little region down here. America sends in more troops who attack along the coast here, swoop down, and push the communists back up to the 38th parallel, where they continue to go because they think, hey, let's take advantage and push them back all the way and take over all Korea. At which point the Chinese Communist Army invades and attacks the American forces, pushing them back down. They push each other back and forth across the line, and eventually they do end up right back where they started at the 38th parallel. Where the line of demarcation or demilitarization still exists today, you've heard about this in the news of North Korea and South Korea. I should also note that technically there is no peace treaty ending this war, or as they called it at the time, police action. We are technically still at war with North Korea, as there has been no peace treaty ending it. That's one of the reasons why they're so miffed at us, not the only one. There is trouble both abroad, as you saw in China and Korea, as well as the Middle East and Greece and Turkey, but at home as well. This period after World War II is known as the Cold War, and specifically in America, the Red Scare. Scare about communists and the infiltration of agents and spies. It is actually the second Red Scare if you think back to the paranoia about communism that happened after the First World War. Spies like Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who are accused of passing top secret information about the atomic bomb to Russia, who blows and tests their own atomic bomb in 1949, and they are executed. Though there was then and is still now some skepticism about their actual guilt. The most famous example of this paranoia or scare is the blacklist started by Joseph McCarthy, also known as McCarthyism. He believes that the State Department, that Hollywood, that every branch of our country has been infiltrated by communists. He claims to have a list of names of communist agents, although the number of names on the list keeps changing. He also is a notorious alcoholic, which may or may not be relevant, but he does seem to be a little unstable. Many times, these people are jailed or investigated or lose their jobs with little or no evidence. It also bears mentioning many people were communists during the 1930s and are no longer communists by the 1940s and 1950s. We, of course, were allied with the communists of Russia, but now to have once been a communist means that you must be a spy. And this fear and paranoia has people turning on each other in a veritable witch hunt. Broadly speaking, there is rapid growth in the economy and government of the U.S. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there is inflation as the prices of goods go up, but not necessarily wages, although eventually they do start to increase as well. They also start to reorganize the government in the midst of the Cold War. In 1947, they pass the National Security Act. This reorganizes all the armed forces under the newly named Department of Defense. Prior to this, there had not been a large peacetime army. We ramped up the army in wartime, and then it went back to being very, very small because it was the Department of War. But now there's a recognition that in a Cold War, there's not really going to be a definitive peacetime, and that we must always be ready. So now it is renamed the Department of Defense and becomes the largest branch of the government, both in size as well as in money. This act as well establishes a spying agency, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to gather information on foreign countries to help us defend ourselves. The next year, President Truman issues Executive Order 9981 that finally formally legally desegregates the armed forces. And this is the beginning of a much broader trend towards racial equality and a broader movement towards desegregation that we are going to be talking about moving forward. There are also changes in the culture and society. a baby boom happens in 1946 to 1964. All that means is a lot of babies are born. Unsurprisingly, after the war, after the Great Depression, many people who had been waiting to get married and or have kids start having kids, and millions of kids are born. And this changes the culture permanently. To support these households, and because of their effort in the war itself, women are more and more taking jobs and seeking jobs outside of the homes. You begin to see new mass marketing. Again, this had begun during the teens and 20s, but in the midst of the Great Depression and the war had been sort of put on hold. And it now emerges with a vengeance. Dishwashers, washing machines, television, stereo, rock and roll music, all of these new things are emerging and being popularized, and especially being marketed towards these new children, the kids of the baby boom, who are the largest generation in American history to that point, and who are going to want to go see music and watch TV and these types of things. You also see new planned developments. Here is one of the most famous ones, Levittown, right? These are the suburbs. People are leaving the towns and the cities, moving to these smaller neighborhood communities, driving back and forth to work, and having, the 2-car garage and the TV room and all the types of things we actually think of as being the true American life develop in the 1950s. I should note, not coincidentally, most of these neighborhoods, including Levittown, were segregated. You were not legally allowed to sell a home to an African American or a Hispanic or anyone of a non-white ancestry. So this is great cultural growth and development for, of course, some people who tend to be more well off and mainly white. All this is under the leadership of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a leading general in World War II, and then he comes home and he runs and wins 2 terms as president. He is the first in what can be seen as a line of modern conservative or Republican presidents who believe in smaller government and lower taxes. One of the main things he does, which ironically is not smaller government, is the Highway Act. And you can see here all of the interstates, 95 and 80, and all these highways are passed and built under Eisenhower. Partly they justify it, as you can see here, as a matter of national defense. So in case of an attack or invasion by the Russians, it is easy to move people and troops around on these highways, not through small 2-lane roads. Incidentally, that is why on interstates, every few miles, one stretch of it has to be straight and level, so it can, in an emergency, serve as a runway for airplanes to land and take off from. The best capper to this period in the early years of the Cold War is, of course, the space race, symbolized by Sputnik, a small metal circle about the size of a basketball launched by the Russians to orbit the Earth. And what does it do? It beeps. It sends a beeping signal repeatedly back. That's it. But the Russians got there first. They got there through giant, awesome rockets, which could also move bombs. And so this inaugurates a new stage of the Cold War, the space race and the arms race. More rockets, more bombs, more competition to make sure that the Russians do not pass the Americans in the larger Cold War. Thank you very much, and goodbye.